Good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy to be here. This is the Office of Graduate Studies and the Graduate Student Association's program, Books and Bagels. And this is the first time that we're having it here at the Academy, so we're very excited about that. I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for the afternoon. This is Mary Jo Verdina, the Associate Professor of the School of Education. So she's going to be leading the discussion and introducing each of our three student speakers today.
I just want to begin by saying that it's very exciting to have this kind of interaction. It's wonderful being at a place, I'm an educator, where we're passing on knowledge, but it's even more exciting to be in an environment where people are creating knowledge through their research, learning new things every day. So today we're going to have three panelists. We have Michael Hamilton, and Michael is a master's candidate from Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Department, and he's going to talk about anthrax, which sounds scary. And then we have Chung Wong. Chung Wong is a PhD candidate in the Mathematics Department, and he's going to enlighten us on how we should be betting on or setting up our NHL pools, because he's doing modeling of predicting sports outcomes, which will be interesting. And our third speaker, Kimberly Olschlager, did I say that correct?
Yes.
Kimberly is a master's candidate in the graduate health professions, and she puts together two experiences. She is actually a lieutenant commander, and so she puts her experiences from the military in with her experiences as a physician's assistant, and is working on how to identify and treat post-war symptoms. I guess she'll tell you those, like traumatic brain injury and all those things, which is certainly very timely in consideration of our veterans returning from the Middle East. And so the format for today will be that each of the panelists will give a small presentation, and we will entertain one or two questions on their topic, and then when all three are done, we'll open the floor to any general questions you might have. You know, when you are a researcher, you know more and more and more about less and less and less, right? Okay, so your world becomes, those of you know, becomes very small. My PhD is actually in physical organic chemistry, and all I thought about was singlet oxygen, you know, for years. So the important thing, though, is to see that your piece of information really just intersects with lots of, so you've got to lift up our chins today and look around us and see how our research, one of the goals of this program is that we look at interdisciplinary, see if there's some cross-section or some common questions and answers that we might have. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Michael Hamilton.
Can everyone hear me if I just speak like this? Does that work? Okay, great. So thanks, Mary Jo, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm a master's candidate in environmental engineering here at Drexel. That department is combined with civil engineering and architectural engineering. And before I start, I just want to get if I could, just ask what kind of departmental representation we have here today. We have like public health, chemistry, biology, PA, okay. Math, right, we have math, okay. I'm just kind of curious, so good to know my audience. Okay. All right, so we've been working on this project for some time now, and this is just one small piece of it. Obviously, many others have contributed to work related to bioterrorism response, and we've been looking at anthrax, primarily because we know it's a risk. It happened in 2001, it was a big problem, cost hundreds of millions of dollars. If you look at all the costs involved. So what we wanted to do with this study was, we have a hypothetical scenario. There's a release of anthrax in the middle of a city like Philadelphia. What do you do? What do you do, and how do you deal with that in the months afterwards? Again, we're dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars here, so this is potentially a very costly situation to deal with. So I'm going to go through this pretty fast. Feel free to stop me if you have any questions. Anthrax, Bacillus anthracis, the causative agent of the disease anthrax, spore-forming bacterium. That's important because these spores can persist outside in the environment for long periods of time. data is a little sketchy on that, but from what we do know, it can be years. So these spores can just exist for years and years. We focused on, there are 3 types of anthrax, the disease. We focused on inhalational because it's pretty nasty. If it's untreated, there's reason to believe it's upwards of 90% fatal. So inhalational anthrax, complicated. It could take days, it could take weeks for the symptoms to appear. And there are some treatment options. Antibiotics is always the first response. There's a vaccine that has been around for about 30 years or so. But as I said, without treatment, your outlook is not good. So this is the scenario. Imagine Philadelphia, Center City, middle of a busy work day. There's an explosion, and a white powdery substance is released. It's quickly transmitted. People moving around. Meteorological conditions will all affect how this works. But by the end of the day, certainly by the next day, these spores have been taken to great lengths away from the original rooms. Now we know that the best way to deal with the initial risk is antibiotics. That's a given. So everyone gets antibiotics. We focused on what happens after that. So the city, you have these spores everywhere. The spores are taken into the buildings via the HVAC systems. Who knows where these spores are, how far they've made it. The problem is that they are re-aerosolized, and we've done some modeling work on this. Again, it depends on the meteorological conditions, all this sort of thing. But we know it's a real risk, so you can't just go back to a building a week later and expect to be okay. So the question is, how do we deal with this? What is the optimal response strategy from a cost-benefit standpoint? That implies we're looking at this problem from a societal perspective. And these are your possible response strategies. You can do nothing, which is probably not advisable. You got antibiotics, the vaccine, we can evacuate, we can decontaminate the buildings, and I'll talk more about that in a second. You could abandon the area, quarantine, or you can do some combination of these above strategies. So how do you find the optimal combination of the strategies? Is the question. Just one note on building decontamination. If you look at the 2001 anthrax letter attacks, which didn't occur too far from here, very small scale attack, and yet it took several years to clean up some of those buildings, just because we didn't have a lot of experience with doing this sort of thing. I just read one paper recently. They estimated the total direct cost at $320 million for the whole thing. And that was just a few letters sent through the mail. So imagine what would happen is if there was a large-scale release in the middle of Philadelphia. What we did for our study here was we took the best costs that we have for these options, and we, using some guidance from the EPA in terms of value of a statistical life at around $7 million, and incorporating uncertainty into the model, we made what's called a decision tree, and I don't know how much people know about decision trees, but they're just a way to structure problems with uncertainty and probabilities. That allows us to calculate an expected cost or an expected value for all the different options that we're considering. So again, in our case, the decision tree would look something like this. And on the left-hand side, we have decision nodes. So these are nodes that we have to make decisions on. What do you do? Vaccinate or do you not vaccinate? It's a yes or no decision. It's something that we, the decision makers, or whoever is making the decisions, would have to do. On the right there, you have chance nodes. So these are something that you don't have as much control over. There's an element of probability in here, and there are ways to calculate. For instance, the probability that you are going to get sick, given some set of circumstances, let's just say is 0.7. That means that the probability of not getting sick is simply 1 minus that, so 0.3. So you have a 70% chance of getting sick, 30% chance of not getting sick, given whatever branch this is part of, and this gets calculated for each possible option. What that allows us to do is when we combine the costs and the probabilities, it allows us to calculate that expected cost, that expected value, which is basically the value you would be most likely to see given those circumstances for that option. So for instance, this path here, would be, let's evacuate the area, let's vaccinate. There's some probability that people get sick. Of those people that get sick, there's some probability that people will die. There's an associated expected cost with that option. We end up calculating those expected costs for all the different options of the tree. And then what we can do is graph them as a function of risk. So on the x-axis here is risk of infection. If we think that the risk of infection based on sampling of spores is 50%, well, that's going to be mapped out from 0 to 1 on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the expected cost. And that graph looks something like this. So again, risk of infection on the upper x-axis, and on the y-axis, we have the expected cost associated with each option for that risk level. Now you can see where the red arrows are pointing to the crossover points in terms of risk where the options change which one is dominant. So for instance, if you look at this area right here, from a risk of 0 to a risk of 5%, this is telling us that the dominant option, the most cost-effective option, is this light dashed blue line here, which is to vaccinate only. So we're not going to decontaminate the buildings or do this other stuff. We're just going to give the vaccine for areas with this risk. Similarly, you can make other conclusions about these areas depending on the risk. In a nutshell, this is what we found using the costs that we put into our model. For very low risks, we are not going to evacuate and not give anyone any vaccine. So this is for a risk of less than 3 in 100,000. For low risks, up to about 4.2%, give people a vaccine. For moderate risks, or what we're calling moderate risks, we are going to evacuate and give people the vaccine. And for very high risks, we are going to evacuate, give people the vaccine, and decontaminate the buildings. So what this is saying is anything where we expect the risk to be above 10.8%, we're going to decontaminate, evacuate, and vaccinate. And this is just saying that same thing in words. The implication of this model here is that for a cost-effective response, the strategy should be tailored to the level of risk. And the level of risk is something that we would get from sampling in the area. And a lot of work has been done on sampling since the 2001 attacks, so I think we have much better techniques for doing that as well. This is not based on the model. This is just a graphic showing that, for example, maybe in this area, we would have to block this off, decontaminate the buildings, but maybe out here we wouldn't have to, or maybe there would be different levels of decontamination. So this is just one of the possible outcomes of a model like this. I just want to make some acknowledgments. There were many other people that worked on previous versions of this project, a lot of them in the environmental engineering department, and I think that's all I have to say.
Since I think it's better to ask a few while it's fresh in our mind. So does anybody have any specific questions you'd like to ask Michael? Other than I'm really nervous right now.
What initially interested you in anthrax? Was it the scare a while back, or?
Well, I think, so my background in the engineering world is kind of this risk assessment thing. Okay. And this is kind of a prime opportunity to apply this risk assessment approach. And I think the answer is yes, it was based on the 2001 attacks. And also, we still don't know, there have not been a whole lot of anthrax attacks in the last 100 years. There was one instance in Russia where they accidentally, there was some island that the Russians were experimenting on, and we have some limited data from that. But really, prior to 2001, the only cases that we know about have been related to animal workers, sheep shearers, and people like that. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you, at what point ethics and morals play a role in deciding what the reaction should be?
That's a very good question. In all our papers, we put a disclaimer that says this is one way of looking at this problem. It should not be the deciding factor. There's a lot of disagreement over how much money do you assign a person's life. Should you discount that if the person is disabled or not? The EPA uses, I think it's now up to $7.2 million per statistical life. And then there are different ways to break that down. But yeah, you're right, there's a huge amount of, and there are a lot of critics of benefit cost analysis saying, you really can't even do this. I mean, what is it saying? So it's a very good question.
Can a vaccine be given after? So if this thing goes in Love Park, I can get a vaccine?
There is some sketchy data on that I would love to see more data on, but there is a notion that when it's combined with antibiotics, it actually, there's a constructive effect. So yes, it would be helpful in most cases to have that vaccine.
And what about the availability of this vaccine?
That would be a question for
we just don't have anthrax vaccine all over the place, do we? Or do we?
Well, there are stockpiles. I don't know what the stockpile details are, but that's something we didn't really consider in this model. But again, an excellent question.
Are there any other questions? Okay, we'll move on now to Chung Wong, who's also using probability and statistics to, but in a much happier kind of environment than the threat of anthrax. It's the probability of winning an NHL pool. So, what happened? NFL. Sorry. And we're looking for the presentation.
So my name is Chung. I'm a second-year math PhD candidate, and yes, this topic is a lot more light-hearted, I guess, than we just did. So what I want to do, what this presentation is about, is how we can use a model called neural network, and we can use that to predict football outcomes. So, quick introduction. I think everyone knows what football is. You can say it's the most popular sport in America at this point. So during the season, if you go on the website, ESPN, Yahoo, whatever, NFL, they will have analysts, pundits, expert, whatever. They will try to predict outcomes of the game coming up next week. But I don't trust them. If you have, let's say, I say Teddy Bruschi all the time because he's a Patriot. 95% of the time, he's going to say Patriots going to win, regardless of who they're playing. So I say they are biased. So, and then I look at this season so far, that on ESPN, the best analysts have a 70% accuracy. And I forgot what's his name, Mortis. So the question we want to ask is, can we use computer to make a program that we can predict outcome better than them? And so in other words, eliminate this bias. So the thing we're going to use is neural network. In 2003, Joshua Kahn, he did as far as I know, he was the first one that tried it. He used a neural network model to predict football game. What a neural network is basically a mathematical model trying to recreate the thinking process of a human brain. So the reason why we use neural network over other modeling or like decision tree, because we need nonlinear mapping. You can win in a lot of different ways in a game. Say you can have a good offense, good defense, or a special team. So what we need is a way to find a pattern that is not linear, and neural network is the best model for this kind of problems. So for his project, Joshua Kahn, he has 200 games data. When the actual data is present, his model have a 94% accuracy. But if you want to predict the future, you won't have the actual data. So what he did, he averaged all the games before, all the data from the game before. He took the average and used that to predict the next game. And when he does that, he has a 75% accuracy. So that brings us to our project. After we saw that, we decided we want to improve on his model. So we have come up with 5 goals. First, I want to expand the data set from 200 games to a larger amount. Second, I want to find a better estimate than just the season average. Like before, so if you have the actual data, it's 94%. If you don't have it and use the average, that's only 75%. that means there is some better estimate out there that can help you get a better accuracy. So third, which I didn't show earlier, I want to determine at what point can we start using the model. Because if we want to have an estimate, we need data from during the season. For Khan's project, he only started on week 14. So the model cannot be, his model was not applied early in the season. So we want to see how early we can do this. And then the fourth, I want to see how good a model in like a previous season can be applied to the future season. Like what we're gonna do, we're gonna make a model on 2005. I want to see how good it is in 2012. This year's 2012. Okay. And then lastly, I want to compare it to Expert, obviously. And then this is another program called AccuScore. And that basically, AccuScore, they are a simulation website. Basically, for every single game, they will perform over 10,000 simulation. When they do that, they come up with a probability of each team winning and the most likely score of that game. For all the websites like Yahoo, ESPN, CBS, they all use AccuScore projection on their website. So if you see here, this is just a sample. This was from 3 weeks ago, the Eagles versus the Redskins. And here, AccuScore predicted the Redskins 61% chance of winning. And when they win, these are the stats of some of the players. Excuse me. So, and if you remember, I think the Eagle got destroyed that week. So they were correct in their prediction. And here's a couple of trends that they say, what happened when the Eagles playing at home, playing away, when the opponent is division, and all that. So it's a very, AccuScore is very accurate in a sense because they do so many simulations. But we cannot do 10,000 simulation. So what we have to do is create a model using a lot less data and I guess power using. So what we did, we have to find out what data we want to use. And if you look at an NFL box score after the game, there's over 40 categories they keep. So this is a sample box score. You will see here you have all these statistics keep for both teams. We're not going to be able to use all of them. That will create a what they will call overfitting. You will be using too many data to try to fit and model, and that will actually create more problems than using fewer data. So what we did, we need to find out which one is the most important. So out of all these, we have to figure out which one is actually good to use in a model. So at the end, we came up with these 5, and after that we checked with Khan, he also used the same 5. So basically what we did is the total net yard differential, rushing yard differential, time of possession, turnover, and home, if they're playing at home or away. By counting differential, that will put in both the offense and defense, because it will count how many yards your offense gained, subtract how many yards your defense gave up. So, and also, by counting the total net yard and rushing yard, that will also count the receiving yard. So you don't have to repeat those data. So currently, we have up to 500 games from week 1 to week 14 in 2003, 2004, and up to week 6 of 2005. The reason we're only at 2005 right now because the first year of a model was at 2005. So we don't want to use game of the future to predict game in 2005. So that's the part with gathering the data. So next you have to create an actual model. What we have to do is break our data into 3 sets. First, 40% of them, we use it to find a pattern amount of data. Like, what pattern when a team wins, what pattern do they have? And then another 40% of the data, we use it to validate the pattern. And then that will be the stage where the model is created. And then we use the last 20%, and we use it to test how good a model is. So the program we use is Enterprise Miner, and they have a neural network model in there. By doing that, our model have a 90% accuracy when we have the actual game data. So model is created at that point. The next thing we need to do is find estimate, like to predict future games, right? So one way to do is the same thing Khan did before, where you just take the average of the season, the whole season before the next game. Another estimate we came up with is using the fact that home team win about 60% of their game. So what we did was we break the data into two sets. The home, when the team is playing at home, when the team is playing away. We take the average separately, and then for the next game, if they're playing at home, then we multiply the home average by 60%, and then we add 40% with the away average. So this way, if they're playing at home, we can put more weight at the home game. And then if they're playing away, we just flip it. So put more weight on the away average. So in 2005, so we use those two average. So in 2005, these are the results starting in week 12. So the overall accuracy is 70%. Sorry. So if you remember compared to how Khan did, he had 75, but he only did it on like the first 2 weeks. So in comparison, if we just do the first 2 weeks, it's very comparable to the result, 70%. So a couple observations we came up with is just week 12, starting in week 12 and week 13, our model is already capable of performing in with a good percent of accuracy. So this indicator we can start at as early as week 12. So this second thing here is kind of my opinion. I believe that we can start as early as week 7. We haven't get to that point yet. But if you have at least 5 data, that will be able to give you some sort of average. But the thing is that 5 is not going to be very good as an average because you need, as a predictor, you should have at least a little more than 5. But we believe 5 will be able to start to at least get a good get an average for you to start predicting. And the last thing is important. Like, we do not use data from previous season to put into our predictor. Like, for the 2005 season, we do not use statistic from the 2004 season for the same team. So that means every season we start a new predictor, a new estimate. Like the example I have there is Peyton Manning joining the Broncos this year. If you use the Broncos stat from last year where Tim Tebow was the quarterback, the stat sucks. So you will completely ruin the predictor, your estimate for this year. That's why you don't use anything from the previous year, but only the game.